Season 2 of Written in Stone is supported by RAB, one of climbing's most historic and forward-thinking brands. For more than 40 years, they've been crafting rugged, high-performance clothing and equipment that give you absolute protection, comfort, and freedom in the mountains. Nothing fancy or over-engineered, just honest, hardworking gear you'd rather repair than replace. RAB. The mountains are our meeting place. Today's episode is sponsored by Tension Climbing. I've worked with Tension for years because I appreciate that they are regularly reimagining how we train. That sort of iteration led to the Tension Board 2. Of all the boards out, it's hands down the best. You can get 15% off of select items at tensionclimbing.com by using the code WRITTEN15. Tension Climbing. Mastery over success. Does Lynn Hill need an introduction? I mean, if you've been climbing for more than about 6 days, then the answer is no. Of course she doesn't. But that isn't going to stop me. I was in Waco Tanks one season, and somebody mentioned that they'd seen Lynn out on a tour. And I asked if they saw her today. They said yes, and then I pulled out my phone to send her a text. And that person got all, "Oh, right, I guess you have Lynn Hill's phone number," making a big scene out of it. When Lynn texted back immediately, they shut up. But that's the kind of response Lynn gets. She's larger than life, and while that isn't how she presents herself, it's exactly how we should see her. As I've gone through this exploration of women in climbing, and I've been really examining the connections and the achievements and trying to put them all in context, I've come to the realization that I fully believe, and I think I can make a very compelling case, that Lynn's free ascent of the nose and then the free ascent in a day a year later is the greatest achievement in climbing history, one of the greatest in sports history. I'm ready for that debate if you want to have it. Lynn and I had been texting for a while, starting from the very first episode of the show, which is about her, and had been trying to schedule a chat. And she texted me one day recently and said, "Hey, today would be good. How about in 10 minutes? So, of course, yes. And I decided that what I wanted to do was just to get her perspective on many of the names I'd been digging up. And since this was recorded before I wrote any of the story episodes about the women of the 80s, there are a couple of things I want to mention here. First, the story I relate to Lynn about Henry Barber and Beth Bennett is incorrect. The woman I was actually talking about was Diana Hunter, and I do tell that story in the first women's story episode. But what Lynn had to say about Beth was just too good to cut out. And second, this was recorded before Brooke Rabitu's recent and absolutely amazing success on Excalibur. So that's why we talk about that as if it hasn't happened yet. Okay, that's enough of my yapping. Let's get into it. Do you want to just dive into this thing?
Let's dive in.
Perfect. It's been so fun, first off, getting to tell these stories, first through the 90s, now in the 80s. And obviously, your name is going to come up a lot. Like, it's not even a debate in my mind that you're the most influential female climber, one of the most influential climbers, period, of all time. So,
well, thank you.
Not even a debate as far as I'm concerned. But what I want to do is I want to make sure we don't miss all of these other women who were like playing an important role in not only building the foundation that you came in on, but then also your contemporaries, you know, the people you were climbing with and climbing around and competing against, particularly in the 80s. So what I want to do, it's going to be a little different, but I just want to throw out names to you and then chat about those people. And some of them I know are your friends. Some of them I'm not sure how well you knew them, if you knew them at all. So we'll just kind of see as we go. Does that work?
Sure. Sounds good.
Perfect. I'm going to start somewhere that I know is familiar for you. I want to start with Mari, because I think that's part of your beginning. Like she was there in the early days. So
She is definitely a good place to start because she is my most important female climbing partner. We met, when I was probably 17 or 18 in Joshua Tree. She and Mike Leklinsky, they're not actually technically married, but they've been together since high school.
yeah,
And
forever
I
and
go out
ever.
and see them at least once a year now because I do climbing camps in Joshua Tree, the Cliffhanger Guides. And and really part of it is to stay with them and hang out, and they have a beautiful garden, and they cruise around on their e-bikes,
Mm.
and they love to research things and talk about climbing and culture and really interesting topics for me and for them, obviously.
Yeah, I've
So she
seen
was
her a few times just from afar. I've never talked to her. I'm a little bit of a fanboy with a lot of the women in the '80s. Mari's one of them. Mary Braun is another one I was a fanboy of. So, um, tell me about those early days a little bit of climbing with Mari.
well, Mari and I were usually the only women in a group of men. Let's call them early stone masters and regulars that would go out to Joshua Tree on the weekends. And we had our own approach, a female approach, if you will, but also, our size was different. And
Mm,
Mari is a beautiful climber to watch. She's very graceful and
yeah,
flexible and thoughtful and very good with subtle techniques. And so we, I think, inspired each other and encouraged each other and went out on a limb with each other, doing like the shield. We didn't really know what we were doing. It was sort of a rite of passage to do big wall routes in Yosemite. And Mike, her boyfriend, well, let's call him her partner, and John Long would, they handed us some pitons and say, okay, here's what you're going to do. If it's a small crack, you're going to use a knife blade, and if it's a little bit bigger, you're going to use a lost arrow, and if you can't get it all the way in, you're going to tie it off real close to the neck so that it won't teeter out. And that's all the instruction that we got. And
yeah.
we spent 6 days on the shield together, and neither of us complained. Of course, all the guys in camp were like, "Oh yeah, those two are going to turn around for sure."
Yeah, of course.
Ironically, it was the two other male teams that turned around
Mm.
and descended off the climb for various reasons. One was a fleck of metal got into one of
Mm.
our friends' eyes, and the others were just freaked out because they heard this blood curdling scream from Yabo, who had taken a huge fall trying to do a 1 day ascent of the triple direct. And he was in his tennis shoes, totally run out. Who knows what caught him because he had nothing in. And
One of those
Mike was
stories.
belaying him and reeled the rope in just in time so that he landed like 10 feet above the ledge. And so those people were a little bit freaked out and they bailed. But we knew the story, and that was not so surprising for us to hear that Yabo did that. And we just kept moving upward and eventually got to the top.
What do you think it is about Mari that made her such a good partner outside of, you were different sizes and had slightly different techniques.
Well,
What
first
was
of
the
all,
like oh, go ahead.
yeah, no, first of all, she was not a cat fighter. Being in sports as a kid, some sports were a little bit vicious with women. They were not
Mm,
welcoming like the men were because men competed overtly and they didn't feel that that was weird.
yeah.
And,
Well,
in
especially
the
back
early
then.
days, yeah, in the early days, women didn't know how to behave. And they got jealous of each other and they didn't want to have somebody outdo them. And Mari and I didn't care at all about that. We were just trying
Mm.
to encourage each other because we had a friendship and we were thoughtful people and curious people. And the attitude of competing against one another really just never occurred to us.
I wanna go from Mari to another legend of that same time, and, in Mike Call's film, The Mentor,
Hmm.
Mari says she was sitting on a pinnacle watching when Mariah Cranner, first did Valhalla. And I think that's just a beautiful connection for her to get to see that. But tell me about Mariah.
Mariah was the first woman I ever met, besides, my sister, my two sisters, actually, the very first day I went to Big Rock. And, I didn't know what to expect. I was very new to everything. I didn't know what climbing was at all. And my sister was afraid of leading, so she explained how to, make a Swiss seat and all that, and pointed up and said, "Okay, go up there." And it was kind of scary. And I just followed instruction, and I was uncomfortable before getting to the first bolt. And then when I got to the first bolt, I felt really relieved, and then, proceeded onward. And I didn't realize this, but Mariah was there watching this scene.
Mm.
And she was so impressed. And she had this huge smile on her face. And she was just so encouraging. And I thought, well, why is she so encouraging? I had no reflection on the fact that this is something you just don't see even today. 14-year-old girl leading her first climb on a slab, with shoes that were too big and not really high
Yeah.
performance rubber. They were the old Rene Desmaisons, RDs, we called them.
Mm-hmm.
It was before EBs, which also were, boat like shoes that didn't give you much precision, but actually they were okay for frictioning,
Yeah.
slab climbing. But she was always a very encouraging person, and I also loved her intellect and her curiosity, like Mari too. They're both high level scientists, and I also studied biology, but never really did anything with it. But I just appreciated who she was as a person, and how supportive she was, and how connected she was with so many different things in the world. She was a very worldly person.
Mm. One of the things I get from Mike's film and from, talking to other people about her and reading about her, it seemed like her climbing sort of took a back seat to um, helping other people succeed, and that she was perfectly happy to do that. Like, it wasn't, "Oh, I'm sad I don't get to climb because I'm doing these other things." It was like, "This is my mission, is to help these other people, and climbing is just the vehicle for doing that some of the time." Is that a fair assessment?
Absolutely. She was a born humanitarian.
Mm,
And even in her interests from studying archaeology to astrophysics, I mean, she studied it all, and she was competent at all of it. And she was involved with Chenard equipment in the beginning.
mhm,
She curated the catalogs and picked the photos, and it was really important for her to maintain the culture that we all shared similar values about, regarding, being respectful of the environment, each other, doing things in good style, and having integrity about it, as well as obviously having fun, and meeting each other out on weekends, and just having a great time.
yeah. When you said astrophysics, for some reason, I immediately pictured Mariah and Chongo having a conversation, about his giant quantum mechanics book or whatever it was that he made eons ago.
I have a copy of it somewhere,
Do
actually.
you really?
Yes. I mean, I bought it to support him
Yeah, of
mostly,
course,
and
yeah.
to see what he was talking about. Um, I don't know if Mariah ever actually was able to ask him questions about that, and
Yeah, I know that was later in her life. Let's move around the world. Let's go Louise Shepherd.
yeah, that's another climbing legend from Australia.
Yeah.
I believe I met her in the Gunks the first time with
Mm,
Kim Kerrigan, her boyfriend at the time. And, Australians, I found out, would take like a year vacation. It wasn't like in the
right.
States, you get 2 weeks, or, if you're lucky, you could push it another week. They would be gone for like a year.
Yeah.
So they had time to really take in each of the areas. And the Gunks was a particular one. And they figured it out. Actually, it's kind of similar to Arapalis in the way
Yeah.
that you
Yeah.
place gear in quartzite. And,
Hmm.
the cracks are not like Yosemite perfect splitters. You have to be a little bit more creative with your protection and small RPs. And that's where RPs came from, the brass nuts. And,
Hmm.
it was because of the need in that area. But they were, following the game and wearing, really colorful earrings and lycra and I think that they just wanted to do the best that they could in each of the areas and leave their legacy, which I think worked, because they certainly got the attention of the small collection of locals. And back then, we were a small group. Everybody knew each other because there wasn't an overwhelming number of people at the crags like today. So
Right.
it was nice to be able to meet people visiting and get to know about their climbing areas and their style, because it did eventually change after those years. And I guess that would be really just the story of the beginning of sport climbing.
Yeah,
But when
totally.
I met them, it was all about trad climbing.
Did her a sense of Tales of Power and Separate Reality and those things in Yosemite, were those on your radar?
Yeah, actually, I think I heard about that because she had hand size pretty similar to mine. And
Mhm.
Tales of Power, is that perfect size for me, like green to red Camelot size, you know,
Yeah.
point 0.5 or well, yeah, just a pretty thin size for guys. That would be a really challenging
Yeah.
size.
There's some moments where I wish that was the size of my hand, but most of the time I don't wish that.
Yeah, yeah, you just have to adapt yourself however you can.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, she seems like there hasn't been as much written about a lot of these women from the '80s, and she's one I've only recently learned about. I mean, I heard her name when I went to Arapalis a few years ago, but I hadn't really dug in until recently. And she's a fascinating one, from the trips over here to do Separate Reality and Tales of Power. And she had some, she did some other great things around Yosemite, and then, was the queen of Arapalis essentially. So
I think she's still there, and
yeah,
unfortunately, they're having to fight an even worse battle of access there in Arapalis.
yeah.
So I hope they make some headway. I know that Henry Barber is really involved in that because Henry went to Australia back in the early days and kind of stimulated, I think, the interest in free climbing and
Hmm.
pushing the level on less and less protected stuff, or at least more difficult stuff that didn't always have perfect protection.
Yeah. Well, you brought up Henry Barber, so I know where I'm going to go next here. Is I just read a story about Henry Barber and Beth Bennett, I
Hmm.
believe, trying wide country, and Henry wasn't able to do the crux, and Beth climbed up and was able to do it and climbed right through, no problem.
Not surprising. Beth has been an amazing climber for a long time, and um, I ran into Jim Erickson the other day, and
Mm,
I think it was him that mentioned a particular route in Bear Canyon, here in the Front Range, and he said, "Oh yeah, you did that climb like I don't know, 1979 or something. I don't remember the actual date, but he said um, that was it's now rated 513." And she said, "Oh wow, I thought it was rated 12C because back in the day people sandbagged the ratings. They would say it was a lot easier than it actually was." So she may very well have been the first woman to do a 513A. So
wow, that's
um,
cool.
that doesn't surprise me. I met her at the age of 18 when Bob Carmichael invited me out to Colorado. He actually lives here now, but we were both living in LA area. And he wanted to do a film called First Ascent, which you can find
Hmm.
online if you want. And it was
I watched
basically
it
a
today.
ficumentary, meaning fiction and documentary. Um, but I was bummed out because they wouldn't let me try to free climb the route. They're like, no, you're going to fall now, and so fall here, and then we're going to go back and show you on your bikes and running and weightlifting and all these things, and then you'll go back and do the route. So I was impressed with her when I met her then, and she's still climbing now, and she's a scientist. So
Hmm. Around that same time period, I think was Rosie Andrews. Is that
I
right?
was going to mention Rosie because I associate her with Louise Shepard and some other British climbers. Why am I spacing on her name now? Help me out.
Jill
Uh,
Lawrence.
Jill Lawrence. Yes, yes. And they climbed a lot together in the Gunks. And Jill
Mm.
actually lives out here. She lives
Oh,
not
really?
too far away from me. Yeah,
I didn't know that at all.
yeah,
A lot of these names I'm just learning about through trying to research all of this, and that's what made me sort of stop this season of the '80s and say, okay, hold on. I had these episodes planned, but I'm learning so much about the women who were contributing that I have to take a break, learn more about these women, and do a bunch of episodes about them before we can move on past the mid '80s because there's so much that happened in women's climbing outside of just the first 13A, first 13B, first 13C. There was so much going on. So
yeah.
talk to me about Rosie a little bit.
Oh, Rosie was a very good trad climber, a lifer. She lived in the Gunks for quite some time, and I think she still lives now in San Francisco.
Hmm.
And I think she climbs, but I haven't actually seen her in a long time. So it'd be nice to see her. I might see her at an event in San Francisco. So I'll reach out to her and connect with her again. But she was, one of these intelligent, technical, driven climbers. And I don't want to forget about also Barbara Bind. Do you know Barbara Bind?
I
She
do.
was
I mean, I don't know a lot about her, but I do know the name. Yeah.
she was married to this guy Kevin, and he tragically died in
Right.
the Dolomites. I think it was. They were doing a multi-pitch route, and somebody fell above them and freaked them out, and so they wanted to get off. And I think he put the rope around a giant boulder, and it didn't hold. So
Mm,
he also died right in front of her. So she was stranded up on this ledge, and um, sounded like a pretty harrowing experience. So I don't know if that really changed her climbing. I think it probably did.
sure,
She,
sure. And I think she did Foops and Kansas City pretty early on. Is that right?
yeah,
So she was kind of the precursor to what you did in the Gunks afterward. And this
hmm
the first episode of these of women in the '80s. I'm sort of framing the whole thing as what if Lynn Hill had sort of disappeared the way that Marty McFly did in Back to the or almost did in Back to the Future, where he went back in time, changed, and he was disappearing in the future. What if Lynn Hill hadn't been there? Who were the names that would have shown up to move women's climbing forward? And Barb was one of my first answers because she had done Foops in Kansas City, which was so similar to what you did on Vandals a couple of years later.
yeah. And have you ever heard of Bird Lou? She was more of
Bird,
a
yeah, she's another
California
one of
climber.
those that I put in this category of like they climb so beautifully and are so interesting to watch climb. I've only seen her on video, old VHS tapes, which I still have on my shelf here. Um, but I love watching Bird Lou climb. And she came up in a conversation with Amy Skinner too. So tell me a little about Bird.
I just remember her from the early days in Joshua Tree. She didn't live in Southern California, so I didn't see her as much as I saw Mari, obviously. But she was, one of the women that was leading and, trying the hard routes at the time. And I think she's still climbing, actually, from what I've
Hmm.
heard.
I would love to. You just gave me this idea because you know that all these people are still around and where they are, and it'll be so fun someday just to try to create a giant Zoom call with all of these women legends of the '80s and then just let you all talk. That would be
Yeah.
so fun for me to watch.
How about Nancy Fagan? We did some routes together, back when I was with the North Face, and we went to Morocco, climbed in Thailand. We climbed in
Mm,
various places, and she was a competent climber and skier and mountain person. But these days, she lives in Salt Lake. Well, she's been there for a long time, raised a child, and I think he's an adult now. And she's climbing better than ever. Climbing
wow.
514s and Maple, and I think she's really psyched to climb. And it's kind of interesting to see women that are now kind of we've been there, we've raised our kids, and now we're back to kind of being free again and being
Right,
able
right.
to live like we used to as teenagers, except that we have the advantage of having kind of carved our careers out, and it's not like, oh no, I got to go get a job and figure out what I'm going to do
Mhm.
to make a living. We've done that. So it's kind of, I mean, you're not as young as we were back then, obviously, but I think as long as you keep fit and keep climbing, you don't have to lose too much and you don't
Yeah.
lose the joy. So that's the main thing.
Let's go back to Barb Divine for just a minute.
Hmm.
Did you climb much with her in the Gunks? Or was she already
Mm,
sort of phasing out after Kevin's accident?
no, I have a picture of us, a group of us. We were out at Lost City, and she was there with Kevin and Russ Raffa, Mark Robinson, Sandy Stewart. Um, yeah, I mean, there were a bunch of people just hanging out. So we'd all be at a cliff, and you obviously can only climb with one person at a time, one person climbing and one person belaying. But we were kind of sometimes sieging the same route, like survival of the
Mm,
fittest, for example, and just pushing ourselves. We would project a route pretty much the whole day, warm up a little bit, but you didn't get a lot done back in the day because of style, and also just the cliff didn't have a lot of different routes. Like in limestone, you can just go ding 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 and tick
right,
off
right.
a number of routes. So I would say we climb together in that sort of group sense.
Hmm.
And I'm pretty sure we also climbed on days, back in, like, I think it would have been 1984, 5. No, I got there in 1983. So, for at least until 85, we were all, pretty connected as a community.
Yeah. I won't name names here, but in my research, there's one writer in particular who every time, not every time, I shouldn't say every time, a lot of the time when he mentions Barb's ascents and when he writes about your ascents, there's there's very often a like the wispy light Barb Divine, was able to climb this route because she's so little and Lynn's hands fit better in the crack. And while these things might be true that their Barb is smaller, your hands are smaller, it's never mentioned that like you also didn't have the advantages that taller men had and things like that. So
Sure.
was
Yeah,
that ever frustrating for you? I'm just curious.
I just think it's small-minded, and it's a little ignorant to say it like that, because obviously, um, we all have different dimensions, and
Yeah.
the whole point of climbing is to adapt yourself to the rock. And sometimes
Yeah.
a move might be more difficult for me, or I perceive it as such, because it's a huge reach and I have to jump or use some intermediate that taller people don't have to do. It looks much easier for them to just reach something. Whereas, if you have to get in on a mantle and get your foot up high, their body's going to be kicking out backwards. And it's a lot easier for me to get into a smaller space. But it's really not the most important thing to talk about. when it comes to
Yeah.
why somebody succeeded.
Yeah, I agree totally. And reading just today, when I was reading about some of Barb Divine's ascents, 3 in a row all made a point to say that she's much lighter than the other people who had tried it. And I was
Well,
just
she
like,
was light, and
why? What's the point of saying this every single time? So
yeah,
I was just
I don't know.
curious. Let's move. Alison Osius.
Yes, good old Allie-O. Yeah, she
Yeah,
was
I've been
another
trying to get
crusher.
her on here too, and no luck yet, but I'm going to keep trying.
Well, she's a journalist. She should know.
I know.
She's probably really busy
She's very
doing her
busy. Yeah.
writing, and she seems psyched to do that. I
Yeah.
saw her
And she has
recently.
been answering questions. So she's very
Yeah,
kind in answering questions.
yeah. She's a historian too, so good person to ask, and she
Yeah.
remembers things. Mari does too, but she's kind of shy when it comes to interviews.
Mm,
She might do it, but chances are it's hard to get to her, to get to the interview.
yeah. Talk to me about Allison and those years climbing with her.
Well, one of my most favorite time periods with Allison was in Les Cèdres campgrounds, and that's in Apt, Buttes area.
Hmm.
And we, basically just crashed in that campground for, I think, a couple weeks, getting ready to go to the big competition that was in Paris at the Palais Omnisport in Bercy. And that was a big deal because that was the first time climbing was really showcased to mainstream audiences. And it wasn't really that well understood. And the wall design and the route design was still being kind of figured out. But this guy, Jean Marc Blanche, did a great job putting volumes, like these beautiful rock like projections, so more 3D climbing.
Hmm.
And I remember her being there and so supportive during the comp, and of course, writing about it. And she's in some early photographs with Yvonne Chenard and Melinda and Mariah and this whole crew of people that were there to watch because it was just so different than anything that had been going on in climbing. So sport climbing was brand new, and she was right there. And um, we hung out with this guy who's Scottish. His name was Spider, and when I saw her recently, she's like, I'm going to go to Scotland, going to Glasgow, so I'm going to go see Spider. Remember? And yeah, of course, I can't forget Spider. So we often joke about that time period, and we just had a lot of fun being climbers and then going to the competition. But I ended up pretty much following the European comp scene, and I think Bobby Bensman and Allison and others focused more on the American comps.
Hmm.
So that was kind of more late 80s.
Yeah. And it seems like Allison is a little reticent to, and maybe this is a journalistic quality, like reticent to talk about her own climbing as much as write about other people's climbing. It was just yesterday I was researching and found out that she did the third female ascent of Supercrack after Barb and then you and then Allison.
Nice.
And
Yeah. Not
and I
surprising. She was right there.
yeah, just not something I ever knew. So
Yeah.
I think it's fascinating. And I really just appreciate her like contributions to the world of climbing journalism.
She was also the first woman to be the president of the American Alpine Club.
Oh,
And
see, I
that
didn't know
was
that either.
early on. Yeah. And I don't know how she
Wow.
did it. She had two boys and
Yep.
full-time job and the president of the American Alpine Club.
Wow. Amazing. I think I met her in the new during the New River Rendezvous. I don't know if it was the same year I met you or not, um, but definitely in that period of years. And before I discovered that she was Alison Osius, she was just like this great person to have a chat with, and was just as
Mm-hmm.
nice as could be. And then I discover who she is. And, it's one of those things that I love about climbing is you can be having a conversation with legend and not even know it.
Yeah. And she's pretty humble, so she
Yeah.
wouldn't try to, make a point of being, a famous climber in your
Right.
eyes or anything. I don't think she cares so much about that as the culture and the community.
Well, let's go from quiet Allison to fiery Bobby, since you brought Bobby up. Talk to me about Bobby, especially back then. I know Bobby
Yeah.
now. I did not know Bobby way back then.
Well, I met Bobby in Joshua Tree a really long time ago. I don't even know what year it would have been, in the 80s, probably early 80s. And I remember her being very enthusiastic. She grew up in Arizona. And so she was psyched to meet another woman climber and talk about climbing. And I think she was a bodybuilder at that time, and you could tell she
Hmm.
was all sculpted, and she's still
Still all
pretty sculpted.
sculpted.
Yeah, she hasn't stopped. She
Yeah.
hasn't really changed a whole lot over the years in some ways.
Yeah.
Right now, she's in Kalimnos, as a matter of fact, and I think she's going to be there for several weeks. So um, she's always been super into training and the culture and traveling and ticking off as many hard routes as possible. And she also did quite well in the comp scene, like I mentioned, the
Hmm.
American comp scene when I was over in Europe. And, she still, I think, likes being in the limelight and also um, supporting social issues at this point.
Yeah.
You probably know about that whole controversy, which
Yep.
we don't need to
The
talk
real
about.
rock
But I
thing.
think
Yeah.
what it proves is that she's an advocate of what she feels is doing the right thing,
Yeah.
and
She
she's not
cares a
afraid to
lot.
speak up.
Totally. And I think she was one of the first women that I thought of as, and I'm not trying to pigeonhole her, but I thought of her as a boulderer, like primarily a boulderer, just because of knowing about her record in the Phoenix bouldering contest, um, and I think she was the first woman I ever recognized as that.
Well, I do think that she has a natural power base,
Mm,
and she does do a lot of route climbing, but I
yeah,
think that power is actually her asset. And if you want to do hard routes, you do have to have high level of power. So she's able to continue climbing strong because she hasn't really ever stopped, and she makes sure that she keeps her power up. She has a kilter board in her garage, and she's
yeah.
like 5 minutes from, well, maybe 8 minutes to G1 and all the other climbing gyms in town.
Hmm. Yeah, she's absolutely one of my favorite people to bump into. She's just so much
Yes.
fun. And the when I first met, not the first time I met her, but when I first had like time to spend with her, it was at the 24 Hours of Horseshoe Hell. We were next door neighbors in our cabins. We shared a porch, and it was just one
Hmm.
of the most fun, like 4 days of my life, listening to her um, for that whole time. She was amazing.
Yeah, she's awesome.
While we're talking about competition, let's go to Catherine Destavel. I would love to hear your memories of Catherine. I know she's not uh, climbing in the same way that she used to. She definitely continued in the climbing world to some degree, but those years where you two were competing against each other um, seem so formative for both of you.
Well, I think Catherine was encouraged to compete. I think initially she and people like Ed Langer were like, "Oh no, we're against competition." And then as it started to come together, they all kind of changed their minds
Yeah,
and
there was like a
decided to,
pact or something, wasn't there? The
yes,
French climbers signed saying they wouldn't compete.
yeah. I think Manolo was, he's Italian, but he never did compete because I
Mm,
think he just didn't feel comfortable with the idea of competing and labeling who's the best. He was happier to
right.
be a legend and not have to compare himself. I think it was
Sure.
just nerve wracking. I think a lot of people felt that way. Um, but Catherine was one of very few women like Luisa Giovanni at the time. There were a few that started to crop up: Isabelle Patissier, Nanette Raybeau, a lot of women that you probably haven't even heard of.
They're
But
all on my
Catherine
list.
what's that? It's
Those
a
are
long
all on my
list.
list. Yeah.
Yeah. So her boyfriend was this guy that spoke 5 different languages, and he had a successful clothing company, and he didn't have to work. So he would just follow her around and try to be like her agent. And at that first competition, I really felt weird about saying what happened, but basically, her boyfriend helped change the rules. I was the only American besides my boyfriend at the time. And I was the only one to onsite final. She fell twice, didn't get up it. And the final was the only one that was on site. And it's complicated if I go into the whole story. But basically, they said, oh, okay, well, you're tied. Normally, we should have done a super final. And they're like, oh, no. They made me wait in isolation the whole day. And I was super psyched to get out there and climb. And they're like, oh, no, you were at the base of the men's final. So you guys can't do that. As though we were watching it. And I wasn't even watching it. But they could have had us on a different route. But it didn't matter. They just took that possibility away. And they said, we're going to determine the winner based on how long it took you to do the routes and your style. And I won the style category, but she was faster, and they gave it to her. And so I just felt like, oh, that's a bummer. And then when she came to the States and competed in Snowbird, the opposite happened. Here I am in America, and they changed the rules so that she could be in the final because she actually didn't qualify. And they changed the rules, and they did all this stuff, that they weren't supposed to do. You're not supposed to change the rules at the end of Saturday, going into Sunday. They changed it. Like, she didn't even know Sunday morning that she was back in the final. And they wouldn't even let me look at the videotape to see if she indeed fell where Mari touched out of bounds. All she did was touch outside where the boundary was. She didn't use anything. They're like, oh, no, that's out of bounds. So she pulled her hand back and kept climbing. So anyway, I understood why they did that, because they wanted to have this big showdown between her and I.
Right.
It made it more exciting. And so as it turned out, I was pretty disappointed. I'm in a frog position. I see this round disc. It's on the outside of the snow bird lodge. And there was a pocket, really shallow 2-finger pocket in the middle of it. And I couldn't even see that. So I jump up and I'm trying to grab the top of the hold. I missed and fell. And she wasn't, she didn't have to jump. She could just static reach it because she's slightly taller than me. Right. She grabs the hold, pulls up, and then falls off and run. So I was kind of disappointed, but I didn't take it personally. I've seen her in different places, trade shows. And the last time I saw her was in Bilbao, Spain. And we reminisced a little bit as we walked around the Guggenheim Museum. And, she's up here. She's somebody that understands my world.
Totally.
She has a book publishing company, Mont Blanc Productions, or the Edition Mont Blanc. And she seems pretty happy. She's got a nice boyfriend who has apparently a really nice place in Paris that looks like a museum. He's a meticulous kind of guy. And, I think she climbs, but not, I don't think she's a lifer in the rock climbing realm. She's more of like a mountain person and probably skis and does a little bit of alpine climbing and probably some rock climbing too. But I don't think that's the focus of her life at this point.
Yeah. Back then when the rules are being changed and you were competing against each other, did that create a rivalry that may not have been there had it not been for those rule changes?
Well, actually, I say that it was the press that created that, because they would say it like, here's the rival, and they would present it as such.
Right.
But in competition, it doesn't have to be a war with the person. It's just that person is close in ability, and it's an exciting event to watch, see whose skills win out. And so I think it was just more dramatic for the media to put it that way. Um, but competition is about trying your hardest, and if you don't have another person out there that's going to push you, it's not that interesting. So
Yeah,
it's good to have that.
totally. Well, I think, and maybe I'm getting this wrong. Tell me if I'm correct. Like nearing the middle to end of your competition career, like at least on the World Cup circuit, um, is that when Isabelle Patissier kind of comes into the scene?
Let's see, time wise. She was on the scene as Catherine was leaving, and Catherine only
Okay.
competed for a couple of years. Actually, after our first meeting, I was excited to see her again at the very next competition in France, but she didn't go to it.
Mm,
She didn't go for like till maybe 1988. So the first one was 86. So she came to that event in Paris, and there I won fair and square. And I actually competed on the men's route, and they told me that they changed one hold in the beginning of the route, but I was the only one to get to the top of it
hmm.
on the men's route too. So I would say I won fair and square there. Nobody could argue
I
that
love
one.
that. I love it.
But yeah, Isabel came along, and she was tall, thin, kind of this. She had this persona of like the sexy climber, and she
Right.
she worked that pretty well.
Yeah.
And so a lot of guys had posters of her, wearing kind of lingerie style clothes, and
Mhm.
but she was a competent climber, obviously. And I remember going climbing with her in France, and she said, "Okay, we're going to go to this climbing area in Briançon." And we were coming from the south of France, and so you know how it is: small roads, people drive fast. But she was passing people on blind corners and stuff, and I'm just like, "Oh my god, I'm going to die just getting to the cliff." And it turns out she became a race car driver.
Right,
She
right.
competed in the Paris Dakar, and so I guess it makes sense now.
Wow, you were there for the early days of her racing career and didn't even know
Yeah.
it. Um, was Robin coming into the competition scene, like, right around the same time as Isabel?
I could tell you specifically when she came in because I had just won a competition in Munich. I won a car and some cash, and I was really psyched. And I think I drove that car 2 Buicks. And that's when I had the famous accident where I fell to the ground.
Right,
Somebody
right.
was talking to me. They were really excited, because they knew that I'd won this comp. And so they're following me as I'm, put the rope through my harness. And it's like early evening, and, we're just warming up. We're just going to do a few pitches and then go to the airport. And my shoes were off to the side. So I stopped, got my shoes. When I came to the base of the climb, I didn't see that I didn't finish my knot
Mhm.
because of my jacket. So I just, and then the rope was going up with me because it was a top rope, and it was threaded at the top. So that's when I pulled the other side and leaned back, and woo, 22 meters, 72 feet or so to the ground. And that was the week before the first World Cup competition in the history of the sport in Leeds. And that's
Mm.
when Robin came. Nobody knew who she was at all. And she entered her first competition and won. So that was 1989 specifically. My fall was May 9th. So it must have been following week, mid May.
Was was there ever a rivalry between you and Robin, competition-wise, or did it feel more like a passing of the torch, or were you just like, "No, this is my torch. You don't get this yet."
Well, I mean, I was pretty solidly established, and
Yeah.
I felt like we were friends. We were the American team. We had zero
Mm,
support. We had to kind of tag along with the French team because she had, just met Didier and was kind of, developing that relationship. So I think the French kind of took us in as, their stepchild. And they made extra reservations for us for the hotel room. They didn't pay for it, but they were like, "Oh yeah, we'll just put you on the list too with the other people on the French team." So we lived together, we trained together. I drove her crazy listening to French tapes and radio and trying to pronounce it. She hated it. And then, next thing I know, I go away for Christmas and she hangs out with Didier and suddenly she can start speaking French. I think she learned in a completely different way, as they
Yeah.
say.
Yeah.
So that was the beginning of some really good times. That was I guess early 1990 when that happened.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so we were the team for at least a couple of years.
Mm.
And then she and Didier teamed up, and then I was on my own again.
Yeah. This is a little off topic, but I'm curious. When I talked to Russ Clune about you, I asked him when he knew that you were going to be the Lynn Hill. Like, when did he recognize the full scope of the star power? And he said it was after you had moved to France and he climbed with you, I believe, out there while you were training to do the nose. And he
He
just
actually
could
mentioned
not
that to me.
believe that the level you were at.
Right.
Is
And
that when
I
you
had no
think things
perspective.
ramped up for you?
Well, he I saw him recently because we celebrated our friend Rob Breaker's 70th birthday. And so he came out from New York with Amy. And he happened to mention that. And I thought it was interesting because I knew that I was in shape. I was running at a high level of intensity for like an hour, like 4 days a week or something, climbing as much as I possibly could. And then
Mm-hmm.
I finally, after I retired from the comps, built a little climbing wall inside this room of my French house. It was a vaulted ceiling. So I'd just spend like 10 minutes climbing around on the wall, doing extra what I'd call pitches. So 10-minute sessions without stopping. And I'd try to do something hard towards the end of that 10 minutes just to kind of bump the
Right.
level. And I had really no perspective on
Hmm.
how fit I was, except for um, I was training hard at Seiyus and I hurt my shoulder a little bit. So I had to take it a bit easy. So I went and met a friend in Anglet, I think that's the name, over by San Sebastian, but in France, where the surfing is. And I took just a little bit of a break. And then I met my friend Pachi Arothina. I don't know. I think that's how you say it anyway. Um, and he took me to this cliff and I on-sighted an 8A plus, and it didn't
Hmm.
even seem hard. I was like, wow, that must be easy for the grade. So, and I'd also just done Mingus, the first free ascent of Mingus in the Verdun, which I guess it was the second pitch of the route. There's like a crappy first pitch that's not too hard, but a little bit loose. And then you get to this really hard section that had small holds, and there you might say that my little fingers were an advantage because I went back with Pietro Dalpra, and he's got big sausage fingers. He couldn't even do the move, and he's a really good climber. But I was actually supposed to do it with Patrick Erlanger, and at the last minute he bailed on me, so I ended up doing it with this guy Patrice, who has reached out to me recently, and I might see him when I'm in France this time. It'll be like 30 years later or something.
Hmm.
But that was 12 pitches, pretty sustained climbing. And I did the whole thing on site. And so I was psyched. My whole training was all about not second guessing myself and just trying to stay as relaxed as possible and as focused as possible when I needed to and never give up. And I guess that's a good rule of thumb for anyone, trying something
Yes.
hard.
Yeah, I think so. A lot of people training for climbing today could learn a lot just by adopting those tenets in their training and in their climbing.
Sure.
What about Christine Gambert?
Yeah, Christine Gambert. She was one of the early ones, like the very beginning of comps. There's a picture of her sitting with me and Catherine on the ground, and yeah, she was a rock climber. I mean, we were all rock climbers back in the day. There wasn't such a thing as,
Right.
a comp circuit. We were creating it at the time. But another strong woman climber. Um,
I hadn't really heard of Christine Gambert before, and then came across a bunch of her ascents in one of Trebu's old books. Actually, he sent me
mhm.
a copy of it from France, and I got it translated and came across quite a bit in there. Um, Another name that I didn't really know anything about, and you've already brought her up, is Luisa Giovanni.
Mhm. Yeah.
Apparently, she was uh, one of the best climbers in the world at that time. And it's what it seems like from me reading is it was like you and her and Catherine and Isabel went back and forth with the first 13A, B, C, D, and then you in the early 90s with first 14A. So uh, talk to me about her. She's a mystery to me.
Louisa is a very interesting character. She likes things very controlled, and so she's happy to stay at home and just train on her hangboard and do pull-ups,
Hmm.
which doesn't seem to be a good way at this point. But back in the day, she also climbed a lot with Heinz Mariacher, who's her partner still today. And
Hmm.
they live, I guess, near the Dolomites in the well, I'd have to say it's in the Dolomite region, and there's lots of limestone, and she's a good technical climber. She knows how to read rock, and they that's all they did was go climbing. So obviously she had
Yeah.
a very big experience climbing on rock and training and pushing herself. But I don't know what she does these days. I don't think she's involved in the competitions or anything, but she probably still lives a very simple life up there in the mountains.
Yeah. That seems to be a theme with a lot of the women, especially of the 80s. They've either gone really heavy into education and science, or they continue to live really simple lives. And I have an immense amount of respect for both approaches, you know?
Hmm.
So it's fascinating to see where all these women are now. Um, Last names I have on here, I believe, are both from the UK, Jill Lawrence and Gil Price, and we've brought Jill Lawrence up a little bit, but I would love to know more of your memories of either of those two.
Well, Jill Lawrence, I saw more often, and actually, she still lives here in the Front Range. Um, and like all of us, we were just climbing mostly traditional routes and trying to push ourselves on harder and harder routes. Um, Her boyfriend, now I'm spacing out on his name. He passed away. Um, Ron Fawcett was his contemporary, and I'm not thinking of his name right now. But
Mm,
anyway, she teamed up with some strong climbers. So I think it really helps to be with a group of people that are pushing the level of free climbing, kind of like the Stone Masters
mm,
for me.
mhm.
Because I mean, otherwise it was kind of like just going out and climbing, like a backpacking experience. You're just checking out different routes and learning
Right.
about the sport and being in beautiful areas. And doing the hardest cutting edge route at the time was not the first thing on everybody's mind. So um, it was on the minds of people like John Long because he was a competitive guy and he's always like, "Oh, that hasn't been done. Let's go try to do that."
Mm,
So I think
mhm.
Jill was kind of in that environment as well with the English climbers, which I think were as competitive, sure, as the American climbers, or more so.
Sure, sure. And I have to imagine Louise Shepard probably had a similar sort of thing happening in Arapiles with Kim Kerrigan and Jeff Wigand and that whole crew.
Sure, yeah, that's just the way it was, I guess.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm curious, who are the women of today that are impressing you?
There's so many. It's just people that you probably never even heard of, besides the obvious, like Brooke Rabbitou, who's,
Of course. Yeah.
last I heard, almost sent a 515D. Hard to even know what that looks like, but apparently it's really hard up into the very last move, and it's probably involves a lot of precision and power.
Yeah.
And getting to that point, you use a whole lot of that, and so keeping it together for that last move just requires a lot of mental fortitude as well as just sheer power endurance.
Yeah. And I'll say this about Brooke. Every time I've climbed around her, starting from when she was maybe 10 in the Red River Gorge, when she smashed my project in my face, um, she's always been so like happy and joyful about her climbing. And, she could lower down from something hard or drop down off the top of a boulder and just go right into a little dance routine and be so happy, you know?
Yeah.
And as a young adult, seeing her climb with that same joy, um, I love watching it.
Yeah. She's a lifer too.
Yeah.
So there's different ways to talk about women in climbing. There's the competition scene, which you have to mention Yanya. She's
Yanya, of
amazing.
course. Yeah.
Watching her move, I think she, like, I did a video, The Fundamentals of Climbing, and I broke down the elements of climbing in a very conscious way. And I see that she looks like she's using those kinds of concepts, whether she's aware of it or not. She is
Right.
perfectly, hitting these planes in the way that she needs to. And, just her record stance,
Yeah. She's incredible.
she's pretty much unbeatable right now.
Yeah.
Everybody's got to go down someday, but boy, she's going to stay where she's at for a while, I think. Um, and then someone who hasn't done as well in the comps that is really impressive is Laura Rogoro, the Italian
Mm-hmm.
woman who's really super thin. I
Yeah.
think one day somebody was telling me this. I didn't read the Instagram post, but I think I did glance at it. But she did like all these hard 514s on site and 514B day after day with no
Mm-hmm.
rest. One
Yeah.
week she went to a climbing area and just ticked off like a lifetime's worth of goals, for most people. So those are pretty impressive performers. But on the rock, you'd have to say Babsy Zangerl is
Babsy.
probably the
Yeah.
number one. She's on-sighted, Free Rider and the Eternal Flame. Well, those were she flashed. Let's say they both flashed those. Well, not the Free Rider. Jacopo did not flash that. He was the first one to try it, and it was probably an advantage because they're partners and they know each other so
Yeah.
well and how they move
Totally.
that it was informative for her to watch him and see what his mistakes were. But impressive flash nonetheless.
Because she's a smart climber.
And she had to do the entire route. That means every kind of move that you come across
Yeah.
on El
Yeah.
Cap, which is pretty well rounded. So I don't think there would be too many arguments saying that she probably holds the number one spot for best all-around rock climber. So
Yeah, I don't think I could argue that at all. And I think that's a cool thing. Like,
yeah,
there, you could talk to a whole lot of people of all generations of climbing. And if you're trying to come up with this, who's the greatest climber ever, your name is going to get brought up a lot of times. And I think
it's
Babsie's
not a
name
current
has to
thing,
get,
but yeah, I mean, in the
yeah,
past.
but I think Babsie's name has to get brought up as well. I
Sure.
think she's carried on a similar thing that you were doing, where you can do all of the things.
Yeah, she's actually excelled quite quickly in the big wall free climbing realm because I don't think she had much experience before she first came to Yosemite, and then kind of learned while doing and saw that she was good at it.
Yeah. What is it that you think? I didn't plan to ask you this question, but now I have to. What is it about you that makes you so good? And still so
I
good, I should say.
well,
You're still climbing at an incredible level.
I like to be engaged and challenged. That's one thing about climbing that I think is unique. I mean, there's a lot of challenging sports or activities you can do, but climbing is just so all encompassing. You can't think about anything but that sort of moving meditation of what you're doing, and staying committed to your intention of, trying hard and not letting go. Um, but also, just before you even step on the rock or wall, I think it helps to have positive affirmations and understand that you don't have to be limited by what other people think. So I was able to
Mm,
shut out all the chatter of, what people thought was possible. To even, try the nose with an open mind required that. It's like, oh, well, you guys all think it's impossible, but you're not
right.
looking at the rock with this mindset of finding the solutions and seeing a creative way to do it. So I just had more confidence that climbing was a new sport relative to, a lot of other sports, and hasn't attracted that huge diversity of people, at least at the time, and the training and diet and all the knowledge that we've developed since then too. So I knew that people didn't have the vision for it either. So
Mm.
having the vision to say, I think this is possible, is a big step. Because if you don't think it's possible, it's not going to be possible. But if you leave that option open, you can find a way to do it. So I think that's one of the biggest things.
Yeah, I think that's a great quality to cultivate, to learn. You know, I climbed my hardest boulders at 45, and I'm just turned 50 last October, and I'm climbing just about as well as I was then, and climbed 13 plus last year. Feeling just about as good a climber as I've ever been. So I think as long as we continue to tell ourselves it's possible, and work toward that possibility, then we can get there a lot of the time.
Absolutely. A lot of my friends who are older are climbing better than ever, even though
Yeah,
physically their body probably could have done that earlier, but their minds weren't ready for it.
exactly. And I think that's the case with me. I was certainly stronger and more physically capable in my 20s, early 30s. Um, but I just wasn't logistically ready. I wasn't tactically ready. I wasn't technically ready. I certainly was not mentally prepared uh, to lean in the way that I can now.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
cool.
Well, thank you so much for doing this and for just chatting with me via text while I've been making this thing and creating it. You're such a big part of why I love history and why I think a lot of climbers love it. You play such an important role in all of that. So I appreciate you sitting down and chatting about all of these women.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed listening to your podcasts. They're really well researched. And I noticed that you took the quote of the truth doesn't get in the way of a good story or something
Yeah,
like
never let
that.
the truth get in the way of a good story. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes there's a few facts that are not perfect, but it doesn't really matter because
Yeah.
you get 99% of it right. And I don't think anyone could get every fact right. So good job on that. Good job researching.
Well, thanks so much, Lynn. Have a great time in France and in Kalymnos.
Thank you. I will. Good luck with everything, Chris.
Written in Stone is produced by me, Chris Hampton, with help from Riley Rush for Plugtone Audio, a group of the best, most impactful podcasts in the outdoor industry. Over the next few weeks, our patrons will be getting an exploration of essays and articles by some of the women we've mentioned. You can join and hear those for free at the link in your show notes. And remember, this show is 100% rooted in the facts, but like Todd Skinner always said, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. If you love what you're hearing, give us those 5 stars and a glowing review, join our Patreon, the Secret Stoners Club, and tell everyone you know at the crag, at the gym, and those guys who claim you could only do that boulder because your fingers are so small, send them directly to this episode, and together we can tell the stories of climbing's most important ascents, one decade at a time. Secret stoners. I wanted to do something a little bit different with this episode. And we've heard a lot of Lynn's stories. I've told a lot of Lynn's stories on this podcast, and she's been on a bunch of other podcasts, so you should absolutely go listen to those as well. But I also just wanted to hear her memories and any stories that were to come up about these other women that I've been reading about, telling you stories of. And frankly, I was just blown away that nearly every woman I mentioned, Lynn knew where they were, knew what they were doing, knew if they were still climbing, and is in contact with a lot of them. And I think it just goes to show how important those connections were back then. And I'll be getting into some future conversations that'll be coming in the next couple of weeks as well. But that to me has been one of the real revelations of this. Is there are always these mentions of these women connecting, and at a time when there were, if you can hear this dog next door, it's driving me crazy. So if it's driving you crazy, quadruple that. Anyway, at a time when there were far fewer women climbing, especially at that high level, it's interesting to see how often they were connecting with each other. And it brings me back to when I had a conversation with Shelma Junn on the Power Company podcast early on in the days of her starting the women's climbing festival that she did in Bishop. And I got lots of pushback from the dudes who were all like, this is just as sexist having a women's only thing. And I think they were just missing the entire point. And I'm not trying to give them a pass here. They were being idiots. But men have that in climbing. If I go to a climbing area, there's going to be another dude there, almost always. And back in the 80s and in the 90s, it was far more that way. Like the dudes are going to be the predominant gender at the crag. So it was a much easier place to go, place to be, space to exist in, and space to thrive in. Maybe that's one of the really important parts, is that going there and not having to deal with any of the comments or eyeballs or just people being in your space allowed men to participate in this thing in the way that they wanted, instead of having to conform. It's interesting to think about it. I understand that a little more today, when there are a lot more women out there and a lot more women climbing hard. And for, 99% of dudes, there are a lot of women out there out climbing you. That's easier to understand now. I mean that it's easier to understand how men could be making the mistake that having a women's only space is unnecessary. Not that I'm condoning it. I still think they're wrong. Still think they're idiots. But I could understand the error in thinking a little more. But in the 80s, when there were only a handful of women really pushing the limits, women probably needed that space even more, which, is where the Pinnacle Club comes in and these women's meets and the way that they were all making an effort to connect with each other. Though I could certainly see making the case that it's needed even more so today because of the sheer number of climbers. I don't know. Regardless, the answer is that it's a good thing. And men should realize that. I know I'm just rambling here, but I'm thinking through all of this in real time. These are thoughts I've had, but never really sifted through. So just putting those out there. I think I have one more interview to do, possibly two. I'm gonna reach out to someone else who I would like to have a conversation with. But Russ Clune hooked me up with another of the women that we've been talking about here recently that I'm going to try to have a conversation with. So that might extend this detour. I don't want to call it a detour. It's not a detour. It's the scenic route. It might extend the scenic route of our 1980s season by another week before we get back to our regularly scheduled stories. And that conversation actually is delaying one of the bonus episodes I was going to do because it may very well be able to add to the bonus episode in a really interesting way. But next week is another conversation with the hardest fought interview that I've gotten yet. I really wanted to have her on the show, and I have tried multiple times, many times, and finally it came to fruition because I was persistent. I'm glad that I was, because the woman I'll be talking to next week means a whole lot more to the landscape of climbing, and particularly climbing media that defined the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s than she will probably ever get credit for, or that she would even take credit for. All right, I'll see you guys next week.